Because I casually mentioned renovating my garden shed, my son-in-law Marcus exploded at me. Do you have any idea how much that property is worth? That house could help us secure our future. I've been saying this for years. Your home is too big for one person. It's selfish to keep it when your family needs support. The kids need a better school district, and you're spending money fixing up a shed no one uses. I watched the entitled rage build in his eyes, knowing he had no idea. I'd already transferred the deed to my daughter Eliza, the one no one in this family even knows exists. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across Margaret Wilson's dining table. At 68, she prided herself on maintaining her independence, especially after losing her husband Robert 3 years ago. The Chew, modest but well-kept colonial home on Maple Street, had been their sanctuary for over 40 years, the place where they'd built their lives, raised their daughter Sophie, and planned for a future that would never unfold quite as they'd imagined. "Mom, did you hear what Marcus said?" Sophie's voice cut through Margaret's thoughts. "The real estate agent thinks your house could sell for at least $650,000 in this market. That's life-changing money just sitting here while you rattle around in all this space." Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. This wasn't the first time the conversation had veered in this direction, but lately, the hints had become demands. "I heard him, dear. I just don't see why my garden plans should trigger a discussion about selling my home." Marcus Donovan, her son-in-law of 11 years, leaned forward in his chair, his expensive watch glinting as he gestured broadly. "Margaret, be reasonable. Sophie and I have been looking at houses in Lakewood Heights for months now. The school district is top tier, exactly what Zach and Emma need. But the down payment is substantial," Margaret finished for him. "As I recall, you mentioned that during Sunday dinner last month, and the month before that." Sophie sighed, pushing her auburn hair behind her ears, a gesture so reminiscent of Robert that Margaret's heart clenched. "Mom, we're not asking you to become homeless. You could move into our current place. It's more than enough space for one person, and you'd be closer to the grandkids." What remained unspoken hung in the air between them. Their current home was in a neighborhood that had steadily declined over the past decade. The school ratings had plummeted, and property values along with them. "I'm quite comfortable where I am," Margaret replied, rising to refill the kettle. "This house holds 43 years of memories. Your father and I saved for years to afford it." "Dad would have wanted what's best for the family," Sophie countered, her voice taking on that sanctimonious tone that had become increasingly common. "He always put family first." Margaret gripped the counter edge, her back to them both. If only they knew what Robert had really wanted, what he had helped her arrange in those final months before cancer took him. The secret they'd guarded for decades had finally found resolution, but not in any way Sophie could imagine. "The contractor is coming Tuesday to look at the shed," Margaret said, changing the subject. "I'm thinking of making it a proper studio. I've always wanted to get back to painting." Marcus scoffed, not even attempting to hide his disdain. "A studio? That's going to cost thousands that could go toward the kids' college fund. Sophie, talk some sense into your mother." Sophie reached across the table to touch Margaret's arm when she returned with the kettle. "Mom, we're just worried about you. Living alone at your age, maintaining this big house, it doesn't make sense financially or practically. We want you closer, where we can help if you need it." The concern might have seemed genuine if Margaret hadn't overheard them in the garden last Easter. Marcus's words still echoed in her mind. "Once we get her to sell, we'll use the money for the Lakewood house. She can have the guest room until we find her a nice retirement community. Most of these places take a hefty deposit, but the house money should cover it easily." Margaret poured hot water over a fresh tea bag, watching the color seep into the clear liquid. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully. but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my living situation. Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then stood abruptly. I need to take this. Work emergency. He stepped into the hallway, but his voice carried back clearly. Yes, Henderson. What's the status on the Riverside project? With Marcus momentarily absent, Sophie leaned closer. Mom, he's under so much pressure at work. The promotion fell through last month, and our savings are stretched thin with Emma's orthodontics and Zach's hockey equipment. We just need a little help getting over this hump. A little help totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, Margaret noted dryly. Sophie, when your father and I were starting out, we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment for 8 years while we saved. We didn't expect anyone to hand us a house. Sophie's expression hardened. Times were different then. You could afford a house on a normal salary. Marcus works 60-hour weeks, and we're still barely keeping up with inflation. Before Margaret could respond, her phone chimed with a calendar reminder. The notification was simple. Airport, 7 p.m. Her pulse quickened. She'd nearly forgotten, in the midst of this ambush. I need to get ready, Margaret said, standing. I have an appointment this evening. An appointment? At dinner time? Sophie's suspicion was immediate. With who? Dr. Levine, Margaret lied smoothly. He's monitoring my blood pressure, and this was the only time he had available this week. Another falsehood, but a necessary one. Sophie didn't need to know that Margaret was heading to the airport to pick up Eliza, the daughter she'd given. Up for adoption 47 years ago, before she'd even met Robert. The daughter who had found her 6 years ago, leading to a cautious reconnection that had blossomed into a genuine bond during Robert's final illness. The daughter to whom Margaret and Robert had legally transferred the house 2 years ago with a life estate clause that allowed Margaret to live there until her death. Marcus strode back into the kitchen, tucking his phone into his pocket. Sorry about that. Now where were we? Yes, the house. Margaret, I've taken the liberty of scheduling a realtor to come by next week for an initial assessment. No pressure, just to give us all some solid numbers to work with. Margaret smiled, thinly. You'll need to cancel that, Marcus. I won't be selling this house. Not now, not ever. Mom! Sophie's voice rose sharply. You're being ridiculous. At least hear what the house is worth before shutting down the conversation. The conversation was never opened, Margaret replied, gathering her purse and keys. This is my home, and what I choose to do with it is my decision alone. Marcus's face flushed with anger. This isn't just about you. This is about family responsibility. Your grandchildren's future. Your husband would be ashamed of your selfishness. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and barbed. Margaret paused at the doorway, her hand trembling slightly on the frame. Robert understood family responsibility better than either of you can imagine, she said quietly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have somewhere to be. As she pulled out of the driveway, Margaret caught sight of Sophie and Marcus watching from the window, their expressions a mixture of frustration and calculation. Little did they know that in less than an hour, she would be embracing the daughter they'd never met, the daughter who now legally owned the house they so desperately wanted to claim. The airport terminal buzzed with the typical evening rush, harried. Business travelers wheeling compact luggage, families corralling excited children, tearful reunions unfolding at regular intervals. Margaret stood near the arrivals gate, smoothing her cardigan nervously. Each arriving passenger sent a jolt of anticipation through her, until finally, she spotted Eliza. At 47, Eliza Sanderson moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable in her own skin. Her dark hair, streaked with elegant silver at the temples, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. When she caught sight of Margaret, her face broke into a radiant smile that revealed the genetic connection between them. The same slight dimple in the right cheek, the same crinkle around the eyes. Mom, Eliza said softly, enveloping Margaret in a hug that smelled of vanilla and something citrusy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Despite the decades of separation, the word felt natural now after 6 years of cautious rebuilding. "You look wonderful," Margaret said, stepping back to take in her firstborn daughter. "How was your flight?" "The usual. Too little legroom, too much turbulence." Eliza smiled, linking her arm through Margaret's as they walked toward the exit. "But worth every minute to be here." In the car, Margaret's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. The confrontation with Sophie and Marcus had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "You're upset," Eliza observed gently. "What happened?" Margaret sighed, navigating through the airport traffic. "Sophie and Marcus ambushed me again about selling the house. They've escalated to scheduling a realtor without my permission." "Ah," Eliza nodded slowly. "And you didn't tell them?" "That I signed the house over to you 2 years ago?" "No." Margaret managed a wry smile. "Somehow it didn't seem like the right moment to introduce the concept of my secret first daughter who now owns the home they're planning to cash in on." The weight of deception sat uncomfortably on Margaret's shoulders. She'd never intended to maintain such significant secrets from Sophie. When she'd met Robert at 21, she'd already given birth and relinquished a baby girl, a decision made in desperate circumstances when she was just 17, abandoned by both her boyfriend and her strictly religious parents. Robert had known and accepted this part of her past, but they'd agreed it would remain private as they built their life together. When Eliza had found Margaret through a DNA matching service 6 years ago, the reunion had been cautious, private. By the time their relationship had solidified into something meaningful, Robert was already sick. The timing never seemed right to introduce this complicated truth to Sophie. "You know," Eliza said carefully, "this situation can't continue indefinitely. Sophie deserves to know she has a sister." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "I know, but after what I witnessed today, I'm afraid of what the knowledge would do. Sophie and Marcus wouldn't just be hurt by the deception, they'd be furious about the house." They drove in thoughtful silence until Margaret turned onto Maple Street. "The guest room is ready for you. I put fresh flowers by the bed." "You didn't have to fuss," Eliza said, but her smile showed she appreciated the gesture. Inside, Margaret watched as Eliza walked through the familiar rooms, trailing her fingers along the banister that Robert had restored by hand, pausing to study family photos where she did not appear. "It's strange," Eliza said, stopping before a family portrait taken when Sophie was about 10, looking at what might have been. Margaret's chest tightened with long-buried guilt. "Eliza?" "No, I didn't mean it like that," Eliza assured her quickly. "I made peace with my adoption long ago. My parents gave me a wonderful life. I'm just observing the parallel universe of it all." Later, over tea in the kitchen, Eliza brought up what they'd both been avoiding. "I've been thinking about your situation with Sophie and Marcus. Are you sure you made the right decision with the house?" Margaret's hands curled around her mug. "When Robert was diagnosed, we spent a lot of time reevaluating our choices. He was the one who suggested transferring the house to you." "But why?" Eliza asked gently. "Sophie is the daughter you raised. I would have understood if you'd left everything to her." Margaret's eyes grew distant, remembering those painful conversations during Robert's final months. "Robert saw what I couldn't or wouldn't admit. Sophie has always followed Marcus's lead, and Marcus—" She sighed heavily. "Marcus sees me as a resource to be tapped, not as a person with my own needs and wishes." "That's harsh," Eliza murmured. "But true. Robert worried that if they got the house, they'd drain whatever equity it holds, and I'd end up with nowhere to live out my final years. The life estate arrangement he proposed protects me while ensuring the house eventually passes too, Someone who will respect what it meant to us. And you trust me with that responsibility after knowing me for such a short time? Margaret reached across the table to take Eliza's hand. I've known you long enough to see your character. You're established in your career, financially stable. You don't need this house, which paradoxically makes you the perfect person to entrust it to. Eliza squeezed her hand. I'll always honor that trust. Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Sophie. She stared at the screen, then silenced it. She'll leave a message. You can't avoid her forever, Eliza said gently. No, but I can avoid her tonight. Margaret managed a tired smile. I'm allowed one evening of peace with my daughter before facing the Inquisition. Later, alone in her bedroom, Margaret finally listened to Sophie's voicemail. Her younger daughter's voice was tight with controlled anger. Mom, I know you're avoiding us. Marcus and I are trying to help secure your future, and ours. The realtor is coming Tuesday at 10. Please be reasonable about this. We're only thinking of what's best for the whole family. Margaret sank onto the edge of her bed, a wave of bone-deep weariness washing over her. In Sophie's mind, the whole family didn't include the sister she'd never met, the woman sleeping just down the hall. The weight of decades of secrecy pressed down on Margaret's shoulders. She'd created this situation with choices made long ago, and again, more recently with Robert. The collision of her past and present felt inevitable now, like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. What would you do, Robert? She whispered to the empty room, her fingers absently twisting the wedding band she still wore. But she already knew his answer. Robert had always faced difficult truths head-on, without flinching. It was time she found the courage to do the same. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the pleasant aroma of coffee and the soft clatter of activity in her kitchen. For a moment, disorientation washed over her. Robert had been gone for 3 years, and she'd grown accustomed to quiet mornings, alone. Then she remembered. Eliza was here. She found her eldest daughter at the stove, skillfully flipping blueberry pancakes while humming softly. Margaret paused in the doorway, struck by how natural Eliza looked in this space, as though she belonged here in the home where she'd never been raised. Good morning, Margaret said, stepping into the kitchen. You didn't have to cook. Eliza turned with a warm smile. I wanted to. Dad taught me his famous Sunday pancakes were medicinal, especially when difficult conversations loomed on the horizon. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Your father said that? Different father, same wisdom. Eliza slid a perfect pancake onto a waiting plate. I called Sophie this morning. The statement hung in the air, simple yet monumental. Margaret lowered herself slowly into a chair. You did what? I invited her for coffee. Here, at 11. Eliza's expression was gentle but resolute. It's time, Mom. I'll be right beside you. Margaret's heart raced. Eliza, I'm not prepared for this. I haven't figured out what to say, how to explain. There's no perfect script for something like this, Eliza said, setting a steaming mug of coffee before Margaret. But secrets have a way of causing more damage the longer they're kept. You taught me that when we first reconnected. Before Margaret could respond, her phone chimed with a text message from Sophie. Coming at 11 as requested. Marcus is joining. He called and canceled the realtor. She's bringing Marcus, Margaret said, her stomach knotting with apprehension. Eliza nodded calmly. I expected she might. Better to have everyone here for this conversation. As 11 o'clock approached, Margaret changed her outfit 3 times, finally settling on a simple blue dress that Robert had always loved. Eliza helped arrange coffee and pastries in the living room, creating an atmosphere of casual hospitality that belied the tension coursing through the house. At precisely 11, the doorbell rang. I'll get it, Margaret said, squaring her shoulders. This was her truth to reveal, her responsibility to bear. Sophie stood on the porch, her expression guarded. Behind her, Marcus loomed with the impatient air of someone with more important places to be. "Mom," Sophie said stiffly, stepping inside. "Your text was cryptic. What's so urgent that we needed to drop everything and come over?" "Thank you both for coming," Margaret replied, leading them toward the living room. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." As they entered, Eliza rose from the sofa with a composed smile. The family resemblance between the sisters was subtle, but unmistakable. Something in the tilt of their chins, the shape of their eyes. "Sophie, Marcus, this is Eliza Sanderson," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "My daughter." Sophie froze mid-step, her face blank with incomprehension. "Your... what?" Marcus glanced between the three women, his expression sharpening from confusion to calculation in seconds. "I know this comes as a shock," Margaret continued, gesturing for them to sit. "Please let me explain." Sophie remained standing, her posture rigid. "Explain what exactly? That you have another daughter you never bothered to mention? That you've been lying to me my entire life?" "I was 17 when I had Eliza," Margaret said quietly. "My parents gave me no choice but to place her for adoption. When I met your father, we decided—" "Dad knew," Sophie's voice cracked. "Everyone knew except me?" "Your father knew," Margaret confirmed. "But no one else in our lives was aware. It was a different time, Sophie. The shame and stigma." "Spare me the historical context," Sophie snapped. "How long have you been in contact with her? How long has this deception been going on?" "We reconnected 6 years ago," Eliza interjected gently, "through a DNA matching service." Sophie's eyes narrowed as she turned to Eliza. 6 years. So while Dad was dying, you were, what, having secret family reunions behind my back? "It wasn't like that," Margaret protested. "Your father encouraged the relationship. He was happy for me, for us." Marcus, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. "This is all very Lifetime movie, but what does it have to do with canceling the realtor appointment? We still need to discuss the house situation." The bluntness of his pivot made even Sophie glance at him with momentary distaste. Margaret took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, literally and figuratively. "The house situation, as you call it, has already been resolved. 2 years ago, with Robert's full support and agreement, I transferred ownership of this house to Eliza, with a life estate clause that allows me to live here for the remainder of my days." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's face drained of color, while Marcus's flushed dark red. "You did what?" he finally sputtered. "The house is legally Eliza's," Margaret repeated firmly. "It cannot be sold without her consent, and she has agreed to honor my wish to remain here." Sophie sank into a chair, her legs seemingly unable to support her any longer. "You gave our family home to a stranger? The home where I grew up? Where all my memories with Dad are?" "She's not a stranger," Margaret said softly. "She's my daughter, your sister." "Half-sister," Sophie corrected bitterly. "And a complete stranger to me." "You had no right." "I had every right," Margaret interrupted, a rare steel entering her voice. "This house is mine and your father's to dispose of as we saw fit. You have your own home, your own life." Marcus was already pulling out his phone. "This won't stand. There are laws against this kind of thing. Elder manipulation, undue influence. We'll contest it." Eliza spoke for the first time since the revelation, her tone professional and composed. "I'm an estate attorney, Mr. Donovan. I can assure you the transfer was properly executed, with independent legal counsel for Margaret, medical verification of her competence, and full documentation of her wishes. You're welcome to pursue legal action, but I wouldn't advise it." Marcus stared at her, momentarily speechless. Sophie turned to Margaret, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to me? To my children? We're your family." "So is Eliza," Margaret replied gently. And this decision wasn't about taking something from you, Sophie. It was about ensuring my security and honoring a daughter I was forced to give up once already. This is about punishing me, isn't it? Sophie's voice was raw. Because I'm not the perfect daughter. Because I don't visit enough or call enough. No, Sophie. This is about me finally making choices that honor all the parts of my life, past and present. Margaret reached for her younger daughter's hand, but Sophie snatched it away. We should go, she said to Marcus, rising abruptly. I can't process this right now. Marcus stood as well, his expression coldly furious. This isn't over, Margaret, not by a long shot. As they moved toward the door, Sophie paused and turned back. Did Dad really know? About the house transfer? It was his idea, Margaret answered truthfully. He wanted to make sure I would always have a home, no matter what. Something flickered. In Sophie's eyes, a moment of recognition perhaps of the father she had known and his protective nature. But it quickly hardened back into hurt and betrayal. Goodbye, Mom, she said, the formality of the words striking Margaret like a physical blow. After the door closed behind them, Margaret remained still, listening to the sound of their car starting and driving away. The silence that followed felt heavy, laden with the aftermath of explosion. That went about as expected, Eliza said quietly, sitting beside Margaret and taking her hand. Actually, Margaret replied, it went a little better than I feared. They didn't throw anything. A small, sad smile crossed Eliza's face. Small victories. 3. Weeks passed with no word from Sophie. Margaret's calls went unanswered, her texts unacknowledged. After the initial confrontation, the silence felt both painful and merciful. A wound that throbbed, but at least wasn't being actively torn open. Eliza had extended her visit, working remotely from Margaret's dining room table during the day. Her calm presence provided an anchor during this tumultuous time. They fell into an easy rhythm together, discovering shared habits and preferences that went beyond genetics. They both loved early mornings and classical music, preferred tea to coffee in the afternoons, and had the same methodical approach to gardening. It's uncanny, Margaret remarked one evening as they worked side by side in the vegetable garden. How much of ourselves is written in our DNA, despite everything? Eliza smiled, carefully setting a tomato plant into the soil. Nature and nurture both left their marks, I think. My adoptive mom hates gardening, says dirt under her fingernails makes her skin crawl. But she couldn't understand why I begged for my own little patch when I was just 6. These discoveries were bittersweet for Margaret, glimpses of the mother-daughter relationship they might have had, reminders of all the years lost between them. Yet there was healing in these moments too, a sense of redemption and second chances. On the Tuesday of the 4th week, Margaret's phone rang while she was preparing lunch. Seeing Sophie's name on the screen sent her heart racing. Hello? She answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Mom? Sophie's tone was subdued, lacking its recent sharp edge. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Margaret sank into a kitchen chair. I'm glad you called, sweetheart. I'm still hurt, Sophie continued. I'm still trying to process everything, but Dad always taught me that family is family, through thick and thin. He did, Margaret agreed softly, thinking of how Robert had embraced Eliza's presence in their lives with open-hearted generosity. Marcus and I would like to come for dinner this Sunday. All of us, including Eliza, if she's still there. Margaret's breath caught. She is, and we'd both like that very much. Good. Sophie's voice warmed slightly. I should meet my sister. Properly. And the kids are asking about their grandmother. After hanging up, Margaret found Eliza in the study, reviewing legal documents on her laptop. Sophie called, she announced, her voice tinged with cautious hope. They're coming for Sunday dinner. She wants to meet you, really meet you this time. Eliza's face brightened. That's wonderful, Mom. A first step. Yes, Margaret agreed. A first step. The days leading up to Sunday were filled with careful preparations. Margaret cleaned the house thoroughly, planned an elaborate menu featuring Sophie's childhood favorites, and fretted over every detail. It's just dinner, Eliza gently reminded her. Not a peace summit. In families, they're often the same thing, Margaret replied. Sunday arrived with golden autumn sunshine streaming through the windows. Margaret set the dining room table with her best china and Robert's favorite tablecloth. By 5 o'clock, everything was ready. A roast in the oven, vegetables prepared, Robert's treasured bottle of port opened to breathe. At precisely 5:30, the doorbell rang. Margaret smoothed her dress nervously before opening the door. Sophie stood there with a tentative smile, holding a bouquet of mixed flowers. Behind her, Marcus carried a sleeping Emma in his arms, while 10-year-old Zach clutched a hand-drawn card. We brought flowers, Sophie said, offering the bouquet. And Zach made you something. The little boy stepped forward, extending his card. I missed you, Grandma. Margaret's eyes welled with tears as she knelt to embrace him. I missed you too, sweetheart. So very much. The initial moments were awkward but cordial. Sophie and Eliza exchanged polite pleasantries, finding neutral territory in discussions of their professional lives. Marcus was uncharacteristically subdued, focusing his attention on Zach and the now-awake Emma. Dinner progressed smoothly. The conversation remained carefully pleasant, skating around difficult topics in favor of safe subjects. The children's school activities, the early autumn weather, a new restaurant that had opened downtown. As Margaret served dessert, Robert's favorite apple crumble, Sophie raised her glass in a small toast. To family, she said, her eyes meeting Margaret's. All of family. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude. Perhaps healing was possible after all. After dessert, while the children watched a movie in the living room, the adults lingered at the table over coffee. The conversation had grown more relaxed, with even Marcus contributing anecdotes about his work projects. Mom, Sophie said during a lull, I've been thinking about something, about what Dad would have wanted for all of us. Margaret nodded encouragingly. He always wanted us to be happy, to take care of each other. Exactly, Sophie agreed. And I think I understand better now why he made the choices he did. About the house, I mean. Margaret exchanged a quick glance with Eliza, a flicker of cautious optimism passing between them. He was trying to protect you, Sophie continued. To make sure you would always have security, just like he always protected me growing up. She turned to Eliza. And he wanted to acknowledge you, to make up for the years when he couldn't be your father in name. Eliza nodded, visibly touched. He was a remarkable man. In the short time I knew him, he showed me nothing but kindness and acceptance. That sounds like Dad, Sophie said with a sad smile. Always room in his heart for one more person to love. Marcus cleared his throat. Which brings us to a proposal we'd like to discuss. Margaret tensed slightly at his businesslike tone, but Sophie placed a reassuring hand over hers. We've been talking, Sophie explained, about family, about what matters most. And we think we've found a solution that honors Dad's wishes while also addressing our family's needs. What kind of solution? Margaret asked carefully. Marcus leaned forward. We understand and respect that the house is legally Eliza's now, but what if we could work out an arrangement that benefits everyone? We'd like to buy the house from Eliza, Sophie explained, at full market value, with the explicit understanding that you would continue to live here for as long as you wish. Mom, we could draw up a formal agreement to that effect, legally binding. The property values in this neighborhood are only going up, Marcus added smoothly. It would be a sound investment for us. It would give Eliza substantial capital that she could reinvest elsewhere, and it would keep the house in the family, our family, while respecting your life estate. Eliza's expression remained neutral. That's certainly an interesting proposal. What would be your timeline for such an arrangement? No rush, Sophie assured them quickly. We're just putting the idea on the table for consideration. We want what's best for everyone. As they discussed general terms, Margaret observed the subtle shift in Marcus's demeanor, the return of the confident, slightly domineering businessman she knew all too well. Sophie seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the idea, clearly envisioning a future where past hurts were healed and the family was reunited under one roof. Eventually. By the time they said their goodbyes at the door, with warm hugs and promises to get together again soon, a tentative peace had been established. Sophie embraced Margaret tightly. I'm still processing everything, she whispered. But I don't want to lose my mother over this. Life's too short. When the door closed behind them, Margaret leaned against it, emotionally drained, but cautiously hopeful. Well, Eliza said, collecting coffee cups from the table. That went better than expected. Yes, Margaret agreed, returning to help with the cleanup. They seem genuinely interested in finding a solution that works for everyone. Eliza gave her a measured look. Do they? Or are they just trying a different approach to get what they've wanted all along? Margaret sighed, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. I don't know. I want to believe Sophie is sincere. But Marcus has a way of reframing his desires as everyone's best interest, Eliza finished for her. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she realized that despite the apparently successful evening, a nagging unease had settled in her stomach. The peace felt fragile, conditional, a temporary ceasefire rather than a true resolution. The tentative peace established at Sunday dinner lasted precisely 8 days. On Monday morning of the following week, Margaret was tending to her garden when a sleek black SUV pulled into her driveway. She straightened, brushing soil from her gloves as Marcus emerged from the driver's side. Margaret, he called with forced joviality, approaching with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Beautiful day for gardening. Marcus, she acknowledged, surprised by his unannounced visit. Sophie's not with you? Just me today. Business stop. He gestured toward the house. Mind if we chat inside? I have some documents I'd like to discuss with you. Margaret's instincts prickled with warning. Eliza's at the library researching a case. She should be back in an hour or so. Perfect timing, Marcus replied smoothly. What I have to discuss actually concerns both of you, but getting your initial thoughts would be helpful. Sophie and I have been working on our proposal. Inside, Margaret washed her hands while Marcus spread several documents across the kitchen table. His demeanor had shifted subtly. Gone was the subdued dinner guest, replaced by the confident financial advisor who'd built his career convincing people to part with their money. We've been thinking about what would be fair to everyone, he began, sliding a document toward her. This is our formal offer to purchase the property from Eliza. Margaret glanced at the figure circled at the bottom of the page. It was substantially below market value. That seems low for this neighborhood, she observed. Marcus nodded, unsurprised by her comment. We're factoring in the life estate, which significantly reduces the property's immediate value to us. Plus, we'd be assuming all maintenance costs and property taxes going forward, which would relieve both you and Eliza of those financial burdens. Margaret skimmed the document, her unease growing. These terms give you the right to make necessary renovations and improvements while I'm still living here. Standard language, Marcus assured her. We'd want to keep the property updated to maintain its value. Nothing that would disrupt your living situation. But Margaret had caught another clause, one that sent a chill through her. Occupant agrees to vacate the premises temporarily for renovation periods not to exceed 90 days per calendar year. That's 3 months, Marcus. He waved dismissively. Worst-case scenario language. We'd put you up somewhere comfortable during any major work. Besides, he added with a thin smile, It would give you a chance to spend extended time with Sophie and the grandkids. You could stay in our guest room. Margaret set the document down, suddenly seeing the complete picture. Where exactly would I stay in your current home? The guest room is barely large enough for a twin bed. Well, that's part of the broader discussion. Marcus pulled out another document, architectural drawings. Once we secure this property, we'd begin renovations to create a proper in-law suite. The garage could be converted quite nicely. It would take some time, of course. And in the meantime, temporary accommodations. He shrugged. We could look at some nice senior apartments nearby. Senior apartments, Margaret repeated flatly. While you renovate my home of 43 years? Marcus's expression hardened slightly. Margaret, let's be practical. This house is too large for you alone. The stairs are becoming a hazard at your age. Sophie worries constantly about you falling with no one around to help. I manage quite well, Margaret replied stiffly. And I'm not alone. Eliza has extended her stay indefinitely. Ah, yes, Eliza. Marcus leaned back in his chair. That's another matter we should discuss. We've done some research on her situation. A cold knot formed in Margaret's stomach. What do you mean, research? Due diligence, he replied smoothly. When considering a major financial transaction, it's important to understand all parties involved. He pulled another document from his portfolio. Eliza's law firm in Portland is quite prestigious. Partner track, from what we understand. Yes, Margaret confirmed cautiously. She's very successful. Which raises the question of why she's suddenly taking an extended leave of absence to live with a mother she barely knows. His voice took on an edge. It's curious timing, don't you think? Just as you transfer a valuable property to her? The insinuation hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. I think you should leave, Margaret said quietly. I'm only pointing out what any reasonable person would question, Marcus persisted. A long-lost daughter appears, gains your confidence during a vulnerable period following your husband's death, and suddenly becomes the owner of your most valuable asset? It looks suspicious, Margaret. It looks like undue influence. Margaret's hands trembled with suppressed anger. Robert and I made this decision together, while he was still of sound mind. Eliza had nothing to do with it. That's your recollection, Marcus said, his tone suddenly gentler, more concerned. But grief can cloud memories, affect judgment. Sophie is worried about you, about whether you're being taken advantage of. By my own daughter? Margaret asked incredulously. By someone who was a stranger until 6 years ago, Marcus corrected. Someone who stands to gain considerably from your confusion. Margaret stood abruptly. I am not confused, Marcus, and I find your insinuations deeply offensive. Please leave my home immediately. Your home? He challenged, remaining seated. Technically, it's Eliza's home now, isn't it? You're just living here on her charity. The words struck like a physical blow. Margaret had never thought of her living arrangement in those terms, had never felt that Eliza viewed the property transfer as anything but protection for Margaret's future. But Marcus had found the perfect words to plant a seed of doubt, to strike at her deepest insecurity about the unorthodox family arrangement. Before she could respond, the front door opened, and Eliza's voice called out, Mom? I'm back early. The librarian found that case law I was looking for. She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, quickly assessing the scene. Margaret standing rigid with anger, Marcus sitting surrounded by documents, the tense atmosphere palpable. Mr. Donovan, she said coolly, this is a surprise. Marcus gathered his papers unhurriedly. Just discussing some family business with Margaret. I was hoping to catch you as well, but unfortunately, I have another appointment. He tucked everything back into his portfolio and stood. I'll leave these drafts with you both to review. We can continue the discussion when everyone's had time to consider the proposal fully. As he moved toward the door, he paused beside Eliza. By the way, Sophie mentioned she'd love to have you over for lunch someday soon. Sister to sister. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Family should get to know each other, don't you think? After he left, Eliza turned to Margaret, concern evident in her expression. What was that about? Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. He brought a lowball offer to buy the house, with terms that would effectively push me into their guest room or a senior apartment during extensive renovations. Eliza's expression darkened. He came when he knew I wouldn't be here. That's not all, Margaret continued, her voice strained. He implied that you've been manipulating me, that you orchestrated the house transfer to take advantage of a grieving widow. That's absurd, Eliza replied, sitting beside her. Robert approached me about the arrangement, not the other way around. I know that, Margaret assured her. But the way Marcus twisted everything, she shook her head. He made it sound like I'm living here on your charity now, like I've surrendered my independence and dignity. Mom, Eliza took her hands firmly. This is your home for as long as you want it. The legal arrangement was Robert's idea precisely to prevent what Marcus is trying to do. You're not dependent on my charity. You're protected by a legally binding agreement that no one can take away. Margaret nodded, but the seed of doubt had been planted. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt truly vulnerable, caught between a daughter she'd raised who seemed willing to push her aside and a daughter she hardly knew who now controlled her home. I should call Sophie, she said finally. She needs to know what Marcus is doing. Eliza hesitated. Are you sure Sophie isn't aware? This seemed like a coordinated approach. The question stung, but Margaret couldn't dismiss it entirely. The Sophie she'd raised had always been influenced by stronger personalities. First her college boyfriend who'd convinced her to drop out of pre-med, then Marcus, who'd redirected her ambitions to supporting his career instead. I don't know, Margaret admitted, the realization painful. I want to believe she wouldn't approve of his tactics, but... That evening, Sophie called, her voice bright with artificial cheer. Mom, Marcus mentioned he stopped by today with our proposal. What did you think? The coordination was unmistakable. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself. I think the terms are unacceptable, Sophie, and I'm disappointed that you would approve of Marcus ambushing me when Eliza wasn't present. A pause. Then Sophie's voice hardened slightly. It wasn't an ambush, Mom. It was a business discussion. And from what Marcus told me, Eliza arrived before he left anyway. That's not the point, Margaret replied. The proposal itself is problematic. It undervalues the property significantly and contains clauses that would effectively force me out of my home for months at a time. You're being dramatic, Sophie dismissed. We're talking about necessary renovations to make the house safer. For you. And as for the price, well, we're family. We thought Eliza would be reasonable about helping family. The implication was clear. Eliza wasn't really family. Not in Sophie's eyes. I won't be discussing this further tonight, Margaret said firmly. But I want you to know that I'm deeply hurt by this approach, Sophie. Your father would be disappointed. She hung up before Sophie could respond, her hands shaking slightly as she set down the phone. Eliza, who had been giving her privacy in the living room, looked up from her book. Everything okay? Margaret shook her head slowly. No, she answered, truthfully. I don't think it is. The following morning brought a tense calm to the house on Maple Street. Margaret moved through her usual routines, watering plants, sorting mail, preparing a simple breakfast, with distracted efficiency. The conversation with Sophie had left her feeling hollowed out, her certainty about her younger daughter's character shaken. I'm heading to the post office, Eliza announced, keys in hand. Need anything while I'm out? Margaret looked up from her untouched toast. No, thank you. I'll be fine. After Eliza left, Margaret found herself drawn to Robert's study. She hadn't changed anything in this room since his death. His reading glasses still perched on the desk, his favorite pen nestled in its holder, his collection of naval history books meticulously arranged on the shelves. She sank into his leather chair, running her fingers across the worn armrests where his hands had rested for countless hours. "I wish you were here," she whispered to the empty room. "You always knew how to handle Sophie." Her gaze fell on the bottom drawer of his desk, the one where he'd kept important personal papers. Acting on impulse, she pulled it open and began sifting through the neatly labeled folders. Birth certificates, insurance policies, their marriage license, yellowed with age. At the very back, she found a thick manila envelope she didn't recognize, sealed with string. Written on the front in Robert's precise handwriting. "For Margaret, open only if necessary." Her heart quickened. With trembling fingers, she undid the string and pulled out a stack of documents. On top was a letter in Robert's handwriting, dated just 2 months before his death. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you've encountered the situation I feared might arise after my passing. Sophie and Marcus have made their intentions clear regarding our home." Margaret inhaled sharply. Robert had anticipated this? "I've watched with growing concern how Marcus has influenced Sophie over the years," the letter continued. "Their financial decisions have been consistently short-sighted, focused on appearances rather than stability. The pattern has become clear. To me, they view our assets as an eventual windfall to fund their lifestyle, not as the security for your future that I've worked so hard to ensure." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she read on. "What you don't know, what I've protected you from, is that they have approached me directly on several occasions during my illness. Marcus suggested that we simplify our estate by adding Sophie as a joint owner on the house and our accounts to avoid probate complications. When I refused, explaining that everything was already properly arranged in our will, he became uncharacteristically blunt." Margaret turned the page, her hands shaking slightly. "He told me, and I quote, 'Robert, let's be practical. You're dying, and Margaret isn't getting any younger. That house is too big for her to manage alone. Sophie is your only heir. It's all going to her eventually anyway. Why not make the transition smoother for everyone?' When I asked what this transition would look like, he outlined a plan eerily similar to what you've likely now encountered. Selling the house, moving you into their care, and using the proceeds to upgrade their own living situation." A cold knot formed in Margaret's stomach. She had never known about these conversations. "That was when I knew I needed to take more decisive action to protect you," Robert explained in the letter. "My attorney advised that a life estate arrangement with Eliza would be legally stronger than our original will, which could be contested by Sophie and Marcus after my death. Eliza agreed not out of self-interest, but out of genuine concern for your welfare. She's proven herself to be thoughtful and principled in ways that give me great comfort." Beneath the letter were additional documents, transcripts of emails between Robert and Marcus that confirmed everything, notes from Robert's conversations with their attorney discussing options for protecting Margaret, and most disturbingly, financial records showing a series of large cash withdrawals from their joint account during the months of Robert's illness. Margaret stared at the bank statements in disbelief. Almost $30,000 had been withdrawn in increments just small enough to avoid triggering notifications. She had been so focused on Robert's care, on keeping their life functioning during his illness, that she hadn't noticed the steady drain. At the bottom of the pile was a note in different handwriting. Their longtime banker, Harold. "Robert, as requested, here are the records showing withdrawals from your account made with the secondary ATM card. All were made at the branch on Main Street or the mall location. I've included still images from security cameras as you requested. I'm deeply concerned about what this suggests, and am available to discuss next steps whenever you're ready." The attached photos showed Sophie at the ATM on multiple occasions, sometimes alone, sometimes with Marcus waiting in the car. Margaret sat back, stunned. While she had been sitting by Robert's hospital bed, Sophie had been systematically draining. their savings. The betrayal cut deep, beyond anything she had imagined possible from the daughter she'd raised. Her phone rang, startling her from her daze. Sophie's name flashed on the screen. Margaret let it go to voicemail, unable to trust herself to speak, just yet. Shortly after, a text message appeared. "Mom, we need to talk about the house situation. Marcus spoke with a contractor friend who can start renovations next month. We should meet to discuss temporary housing options for you while the work is happening. It would be easier if Eliza wasn't part of this conversation. Family matters should stay in the family." Margaret stared at the message, suddenly seeing Sophie through Robert's eyes, not as the little girl they'd raised with such love and hope, but as the woman she'd become under Marcus's influence. A woman who could steal from her dying father. A woman who could plot to displace her widowed mother for financial gain. When Eliza returned an hour later, she found Margaret still in Robert's study, the documents spread around her. "Mom, what's all this?" she asked, setting down her purse. Margaret looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "The truth," she said simply. "Robert knew what they were planning. He documented everything." Eliza scanned the papers quickly, her expression growing grave. "He never told me about the withdrawals," she said softly. "He only said he was concerned about their intentions toward you." "He was protecting me," Margaret replied. "Even then, he was protecting me." She picked up Sophie's text message and handed her phone to Eliza. "They're not going to stop. They've already scheduled renovations to begin next month, assuming I'll simply move out when told." Eliza read the message, her attorney's mind clearly analyzing the implications. "This is becoming harassment," she observed. "We may need to consider legal measures to stop them from continuing to pressure you." "Not yet," Margaret said, gathering the documents carefully. "First, I need to confront Sophie with what I know. She needs to understand that I'm fully aware of what happened during Robert's illness." "Are you sure that's wise?" Eliza asked gently. "It might just escalate the situation." Margaret straightened the papers with a decisive tap against the desk. "I'm done being manipulated by my own daughter. Robert kept these secrets to protect me during his illness, but I don't need that protection anymore." She looked up at Eliza, a new resolve hardening in her eyes. "I need the truth, all of it, and Sophie needs to know that I know." Later that afternoon, Margaret composed a carefully worded email to Sophie, attaching scanned copies of the ATM photos and bank statements. She wrote simply, "I've discovered what you and Marcus did during your father's illness. I know about the conversations you had with him about simplifying our estate. I know everything, Sophie. Do not contact me again regarding the house. Any further attempts to pressure me will result in legal action." Her finger hovered over the send button for several long moments before she finally pressed it. A wave of grief washed over her, not just for Robert now, but for the daughter she'd thought she knew, for the family that had fractured beyond repair. Eliza found her sitting quietly on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the garden in golden hues. "Tea?" she offered, setting down a steaming mug. Margaret accepted it gratefully. "I sent Sophie the evidence," she said. "I don't know if it will stop them, but at least now she knows that I know." Eliza sat beside her, her own mug cradled between her hands. "What happens now?" Margaret took a slow sip, considering the question. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "But for the first time since Robert died, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground. The truth is painful, but it's better than living with manipulation and lies." They sat in companionable silence as darkness gradually settled over the garden. Margaret's phone remained silent, no calls or messages from Sophie. Whether that silence represented shock, shame, or strategic retreat remained to be seen. "Robert would be proud of you," Eliza said finally, "for standing up for yourself." Margaret smiled faintly. "I think he'd be proud of both of us, for finding each other, for becoming family in the ways that truly matter. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret felt a curious sense of peace settling over her. The path ahead might be difficult, but at least now she could see it clearly. The response to Margaret's email came precisely 36 hours later, not from Sophie, but from Marcus. The notification appeared while Margaret was teaching Eliza how to properly prune the chi. Rose bushes Robert had planted along the eastern side of the house. "I never had a garden growing up," Eliza admitted, carefully following Margaret's demonstration. "Our apartment in Chicago had a small balcony, but my mother's idea of gardening was a pot of herbs that inevitably died from neglect." Margaret smiled, guiding Eliza's hand to the correct angle for the cut. "Your father, Robert, used to say that gardening teaches patience. You can't rush a rose." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the chime of Margaret's phone. She pulled off her gardening gloves and retrieved it from her pocket, her expression darkening as she read the message. "It's from Marcus," she said, showing the screen to Eliza. "He wants to meet tomorrow to clear up misunderstandings and discuss a path forward that benefits everyone." Eliza frowned. "That's surprisingly measured, considering the evidence you sent Sophie." "He's a businessman," Margaret replied, tucking the phone away. "When direct pressure fails, he pivots to negotiation. I've seen it before." That evening, they discussed their options over dinner. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of Margaret's beef stew, a recipe she'd perfected over decades of family meals. Eliza had baked fresh bread to accompany it, the two of them moving around the kitchen in a comfortable rhythm that belied their relatively short time together. "You don't have to meet with them at all," Eliza pointed out, breaking a piece of bread. "You've made your position clear." Margaret stirred her stew thoughtfully. "True, but ignoring them completely won't make them disappear from our lives." "Our lives," Eliza echoed with a small smile. "It still feels strange sometimes, being part of a we with you." Margaret reached across the table to cover Eliza's hand with her own. Strange but right, somehow, despite everything. After dinner, they settled in the living room with cups of tea. Outside, rain began to fall, droplets tapping gently against the windows. Margaret gazed around the room, taking in the photographs on the mantel. Sophie's graduation, Robert holding infant Zach, their 40th anniversary celebration. A life documented in carefully framed moments. "I keep thinking about what Robert would do in this situation," she said finally. "He always knew how to handle difficult conversations." "What would he say?" Eliza asked. Margaret closed her eyes, imagining Robert's calm, measured voice. He'd say, "Maggie, you can't control how others behave, only how you respond." That was his mantra whenever Sophie went through difficult phases growing up. She opened her eyes, a new resolve settling over her. "I need to respond on my terms, not theirs. This house, our home, it's not just about property value or inheritance. It's about dignity and respect. About my right to live my remaining years without manipulation or control." "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked, noting the shift in Margaret's demeanor. "I'm thinking it's time for a change," Margaret replied, setting down her teacup decisively. "Meeting with them tomorrow won't solve anything fundamental. Marcus will present another offer, perhaps slightly more generous on the surface but with the same underlying goal, getting control of this house and, by extension, control over me." She rose and walked to the window, watching raindrops trace patterns down the glass. "Robert protected me the only way he knew how, by arranging the legal transfer. But perhaps there's a different kind of protection I need now." "What kind?" Eliza asked softly. Margaret turned, her expression resolute. "Distance, clarity, a fresh perspective." She took a deep breath. "Eliza, how would you feel about taking a trip together? Not just for a weekend, but for a while. Perhaps to your home in Portland?" Eliza looked surprised. "You want to leave?" "But this house, your garden, will still be here," Margaret finished. The house isn't going anywhere, legally speaking. And perhaps some time away would help Sophie and Marcus understand that I'm serious about maintaining my independence. You're talking about making a statement, Eliza observed. I'm talking about taking control of my own narrative, Margaret clarified. For too long, I've been reacting to their demands, their expectations. Even my decision to send that evidence was reactive. I want to make a proactive choice for myself. She returned to her chair, leaning forward earnestly. Portland is supposedly beautiful in the spring. You've told me so much about your home there, your neighborhood, your friends. I'd like to see it, to understand that part of your life. Eliza considered the proposal. My townhouse has a guest room that's hardly used. It's not as spacious as this place, but it's comfortable. And the neighborhood is walkable. Shops, cafes, a wonderful farmer's market on Saturdays. It sounds perfect, Margaret said, her enthusiasm growing. I could get to know your world, just as you've come to know mine. And meanwhile, this house would sit empty. A physical reminder to Sophie and Marcus that their schemes haven't succeeded. Are you sure about this? Eliza asked. It's a big step. Margaret nodded slowly. I think it's necessary, not as a punishment for Sophie, but as an assertion of my own agency. Robert always said that sometimes you need to step back from a problem to see it clearly. When would you want to leave? Soon, Margaret decided. Before the meeting tomorrow, we could call and cancel, pack what we need, and be on the road by noon. The boldness of the plan energized her. For months after Robert's death, she had barely left the house, finding comfort in familiar surroundings. Even simple errands had required enormous effort. But now, the prospect of a complete change of scene felt like exactly what she needed. A declaration of independence, a reclaiming of her life. What about your medical appointments? Your prescriptions? Eliza asked practically. My blood pressure medication can be transferred to any pharmacy, and I'm due for a checkup, but that can be rescheduled or handled by a doctor in Portland. Margaret waved away these concerns. I'm not running away, Eliza. I'm running toward something. A new chapter, a different perspective. As they discussed logistics late into the evening, Margaret felt a growing sense of certainty. This was the right decision, not just to avoid the confrontation with Marcus, but to demonstrate through actions rather than words that she would not be manipulated or controlled. We should leave a letter, she decided as they finalized their plans. Not for Sophie and Marcus. I've said all I need to say to them for now, but for Mrs. Rivera next door, so she can keep an eye on the house and know how to reach us if needed. Eliza. Agreed, impressed by Margaret's thoroughness. What about the children, Zach and Emma? Margaret's expression softened. I'll write them a separate note. They shouldn't suffer for their parents' actions. Perhaps we can arrange video calls once we're settled in Portland. That night, Margaret slept more soundly than she had in weeks. The decision, once made, had lifted a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged was pressing on her. In the morning, she woke early and moved through the house with purpose, selecting clothing, medications, and a few treasured mementos to pack. In Robert's study, she paused before his photograph, touching the frame gently. I'm doing what you would have wanted, she told him softly. Taking care of myself, not just surviving, but living. By 11 o'clock, their suitcases were packed and loaded into Eliza's car. Margaret wrote the promised notes, one for Mrs. Rivera with contact information and a brief explanation, another for her grandchildren expressing her love and promising to be in touch soon. As she placed these on the kitchen counter, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. On our way. See you at 1 p.m. as agreed. Margaret showed the message to Eliza, with a small, defiant smile. Perfect timing. They'll arrive to find an empty house and a decision already made. She took one last walk through the home she'd shared with Robert for over 4 decades. Each room held memories, some joyful, some painful, all precious. But as she rejoined Eliza at the front door, she felt not grief, but anticipation. "Ready?" Eliza asked, keys in hand. Margaret nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Ready?" As they pulled away from the house on Maple Street, Margaret didn't look back. She fixed her gaze forward, toward the highway that would carry them west, toward a temporary new home with her firstborn daughter, toward a future she was choosing for herself. "You know," she said, as the familiar landmarks of her neighborhood receded behind them, "Robert always wanted to visit the Pacific Northwest. He talked about taking a trip after retirement, seeing the mountains, the coastline." "We can do all of that," Eliza assured her, smoothly merging onto the highway. "Portland makes an excellent base for exploring." Margaret smiled, watching the landscape change through the window. The decision to leave had not been made lightly, but now that they were underway, it felt right. A declaration of independence more powerful than any words could express. For the first time since Robert's death, she was moving forward rather than merely enduring. Whatever Sophie and Marcus might do next, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them on her own terms, with the quiet strength Robert had always valued in her. "To new beginnings," she murmured, as the city where she'd spent her entire adult life disappeared in the rearview mirror. "To new beginnings," Eliza echoed, and pressed the accelerator. Portland greeted them with a week of relentless spring rain. Margaret watched it stream down the windows of Eliza's townhouse, transforming the view of the tree-lined street into an impressionist painting, all blurred edges and muted colors. Despite the dreary weather, she found herself enchanted by the city's lush greenery, so different from the manicured suburban landscapes she'd known all her life. "It's like living inside a terrarium," she remarked to Eliza over morning coffee. "Everything feels so alive." Eliza's home was exactly as she described it, smaller than the house on Maple Street, but thoughtfully arranged with clean lines and comfortable furnishings. Walls of built-in bookshelves displayed an eclectic collection of legal texts, literary novels, and art books. Large windows compensated for the Pacific Northwest's famous gray skies, bathing the open-plan living area in gentle light even on cloudy days. The guest room, now Margaret's room, overlooked a small but meticulously maintained garden where ferns and hostas thrived in the dappled shade. She'd arranged her few belongings with care, placing Robert's photograph on the bedside table and her watercolors on the desk by the window. They settled into an easy routine. Mornings began with shared coffee and breakfast, after which Eliza would work remotely at her dining table, while Margaret explored the neighborhood or experimented with her painting. In the evenings, they would cook together, Eliza learning Margaret's recipes while sharing some of her own discoveries from years of urban single life. "Any messages?" Eliza asked cautiously on their fifth morning in Portland, nodding toward Margaret's phone as she poured coffee. Margaret shook her head. "Nothing, from Sophie or Marcus. Not directly, at least." What she didn't mention was the increasingly frantic texts from Sophie to Zach's tablet, messages the boy had dutifully forwarded to his grandmother's phone with confused queries about when she was coming home. It appeared that Sophie was attempting to track Margaret through her grandson, a tactic that left a sour taste in her mouth. She had responded directly to Zach, reassuring him that she was fine, just taking a trip with a friend, and would video chat with him and Emma soon. To Sophie's indirect probing, she returned only silence. "Mrs. Rivera called yesterday," Margaret added, accepting the steaming mug Eliza offered. "Apparently, Sophie and Marcus have been to the house twice. The second time, they brought someone who looked at the roof and windows. A contractor, Mrs. Rivera thinks." Eliza frowned. "They can't legally make any changes to the property." "I know, but they seem determined to proceed as if they can." Margaret sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Robert always said that people reveal themselves through their actions, when they think no one is watching. By the end of their second week in Portland, the rain had finally cleared, revealing stunning views of Mount Hood on the horizon. Eliza took a day off work to show Margaret the city properly. The famous rose gardens, Powell's books, where Margaret lost herself for hours among the shelves. And finally, a walk along the Willamette River as sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. "It's beautiful here," Margaret said, pausing to watch a heron stalk fish in the shallows. "I can see why you love it." "It suits me," Eliza agreed. "Though I'm starting to understand the appeal of a proper garden like yours. My pitiful container. Plants are hardly a substitute." They settled on a riverside bench, watching joggers and cyclists pass by on the path before them. In the comfortable silence, Margaret found herself reflecting on the whirlwind changes of the past months. The confrontation with Sophie and Marcus, the discovery of Robert's hidden documentation, the sudden decision to leave her home of 4 decades. It should have felt overwhelming, destabilizing. Instead, she experienced an unexpected sense of liberation. "I've been thinking," she said finally, "about what happens next." Eliza turned to her, waiting patiently for her to continue. "We left in a hurry, as a tactical retreat," Margaret explained. "But we need a more comprehensive strategy now. Sophie and Marcus won't simply give up because I've temporarily removed myself from their reach." "What are you considering?" Eliza asked. Margaret pulled a small notebook from her purse, the same one she'd used for grocery lists and garden planning for years, now repurposed for a different kind of organization. "First, I need to secure my financial independence completely," she said, flipping to a page filled with her neat handwriting. "I still have joint accounts with Sophie, established years ago for emergency purposes. Those need to be closed." Eliza nodded approvingly. "Sensible. We can find a local branch of your bank tomorrow. Next, I need to update my medical directives. And power of attorney. Robert and I had designated Sophie for those roles, for obvious reasons at the time." Margaret's tone remained matter-of-fact, though the implications, the complete severing of trust, hung heavily between them. "I can recommend an excellent elder law attorney here in Portland," Eliza offered. "Someone completely unconnected to me professionally, to avoid any appearance of influence." "Good." Margaret checked the item on her list. "And then there's the matter of the house itself." Eliza tensed slightly. "I hope you know I have no intention of selling it, regardless of what Marcus offers." "I know," Margaret assured her. "But the current arrangement leaves them room to continue applying pressure. They believe that eventually one of us will relent, that my attachment to the house will fade with distance, or that you'll decide the financial offer outweighs the hassle of managing a property across the country. What do you suggest?" Margaret closed her notebook deliberately. "I think we should make it clear that the house will never be theirs, under any circumstances. That means deciding what will ultimately happen to it, and ensuring they understand. That decision is irreversible." She turned to face Eliza directly. "I've been researching charitable remainder trusts. We could place the house in trust, with the agreement that after my lifetime tenancy, it would be sold, and the proceeds donated to a cause Robert and I believed in. Perhaps the scholarship fund at the community college where he taught, or the cancer research center that cared for him." Eliza considered the proposal thoughtfully. That would effectively remove any financial incentive for them to continue pursuing the property. They could never profit from it, no matter how long they waited or how much pressure they applied. "Exactly," Margaret nodded. "And it would honor Robert's legacy in a meaningful way." "It's a significant decision," Eliza cautioned. "One that would be difficult to reverse." "I'm aware," Margaret replied with quiet certainty. "But I believe it's the right one. The house has become a battleground, a source of conflict and pain. This way, it becomes something positive again, a gift to future students or patients." As they discussed the details, mapping out next steps and potential complications, Margaret felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about thwarting Sophie and Marcus's schemes. It was about reclaiming agency over her life and her legacy. Following days were filled with appointments, the bank, the attorney's office, video consultations with financial advisors. Each completed task strengthened Margaret's resolve. She wasn't just running away. She was methodically rebuilding her life on new foundations, more secure than before. Between appointments, she explored Portland with growing confidence, sometimes venturing out alone while Eliza worked. She discovered a small art supply store near the townhouse and began building a collection of watercolors and brushes. The owner, a silver-haired woman named Diane with paint-stained hands and a quick laugh, recognized a kindred spirit and invited Margaret to join a weekly painting group that met in the park when weather permitted. "Beginners welcome," she assured Margaret. "Though something tells me you're not entirely a beginner." "Just very rusty," Margaret admitted. "It's been decades since I painted regularly." 3 weeks into their Portland sojourn, the attorney Eliza had recommended presented them with completed documents for the Charitable Remainder Trust. As Margaret signed the papers, officially designating Robert's beloved community college as the eventual beneficiary of the house on Maple Street, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "We should inform Sophie," she said afterward as they walked home through a neighborhood of Victorian houses. "Not because we need her approval, but because she should hear it from me directly, not from a legal notice. Are you ready for that?" "Conversation?" Eliza asked gently. Margaret nodded, her expression serene but determined. "I think I am. It won't be pleasant, but it's necessary. She needs to understand that this chapter is closed, that the house will never be hers to sell or renovate or use as leverage against me." That evening, she composed a careful email to Sophie, explaining the trust arrangement in straightforward terms. She concluded with words she had been considering for days. "This decision isn't about punishing you or depriving your children of an inheritance. It's about honoring your father's wishes and protecting the dignity of my remaining years. The legacy Robert and I wish to leave isn't measured in property values or assets to be divided, but in the values we tried to instill: integrity, compassion, and respect for others' autonomy. I hope someday you'll understand that. I remain, always, your mother who loves you." After sending the email, Margaret joined Eliza on the small balcony overlooking the street. The evening air was crisp but not cold, fragrant with blooming jasmine from the neighboring garden. "It's done," she said simply, accepting the glass of wine Eliza offered. "How do you feel?" Eliza asked. Margaret considered the question, watching. A family with young children walk past below, the little ones jumping in leftover puddles from the afternoon's brief shower. "Peaceful," she decided, "like I've honored Robert properly. And myself." They clinked glasses gently, the soft sound carrying, in the quiet evening air. Whatever reaction might come from Sophie, anger, accusations, perhaps even belated understanding, Margaret felt prepared to face it. She had created not just distance but clarity, transforming a reactive retreat into a deliberate path forward. Sophie's response came 3 days later. Margaret was at the neighborhood farmers market with Diane from the art store when her phone chimed with the notification. She finished selecting a bundle of fresh lavender from a vendor's stall before checking. The message: "We need to talk. Not by email, face to face." The words were terse, stripped of any familial warmth. Margaret slipped the phone back into her pocket, determined not to let the message disturb the peaceful rhythm of her morning. She and Diane continued their leisurely circuit of the market, filling their bags with fresh produce, artisanal bread, and a wedge of locally made cheese that the vendor insisted would change your entire perspective on dairy. "Everything all right?" Diane asked as they paused for coffee at a bustling stand. "You seem distracted." Margaret considered deflecting but found herself answering honestly. "My daughter wants to talk about decisions she doesn't agree with." Diane's weathered face creased with understanding. "Ah, the joys of adult children believing they know what's best for us. My son tried to convince me to sell my store last year. Said the online marketplace was the future and I was being stubborn. What did you do? Margaret asked, accepting the steaming paper cup. Invited him to spend a week working in the shop with me? Diane chuckled. By day 3, he'd connected with more local artists than he could count and admitted there might be something to this antiquated business model after all. Margaret smiled, appreciating the simplicity of the solution. Unfortunately, my situation is more complicated. They always are, Diane agreed sagely. But remember, you're under no obligation to justify your choices to anyone, not even your children. Especially not at our age. When Margaret returned to the townhouse, arms laden with market treasures, she found Eliza on her laptop at the dining table. Legal briefs spread around her. Good haul? Eliza asked, looking up with a smile. The strawberries alone were worth the trip, Margaret confirmed, setting her bags on the counter. Sophie wants to talk, in person. Eliza's expression grew serious. What are you thinking? Margaret unpacked the produce methodically, arranging berries in a colander to wash. I'm thinking it's time, but on my terms, not hers. Video call rather than in person? Exactly. I'm not ready to return to Maple Street, and I certainly don't want her coming here. Margaret paused, a bunch of spring onions in hand. This place feels like a sanctuary of sorts. I'm not ready to breach that. Later that afternoon, Margaret composed a brief reply to Sophie. I'm willing to speak by video call tomorrow at 2 p.m. Pacific time. This is non-negotiable. If that doesn't work, for you, let me know an alternative time. But the format remains the same. Sophie's response was immediate and sharp. Fine, but just you, not your other daughter. The tone confirmed Margaret's instinct to maintain physical distance. Agreed, she replied simply. That evening, she prepared herself mentally for the confrontation, sitting in the small meditation garden behind Eliza's townhouse. The space was barely 10 feet square, but thoughtfully designed with a stone bench, a miniature fountain whose gentle, burbling masked street noise, and carefully arranged plantings that created an impression of depth. I've always found it helps to clear my mind here, Eliza had told her when first showing her the garden, when a case gets too tangled or a client too difficult. As twilight settled over Portland, Margaret found the peaceful setting helped crystallize her thoughts. She would listen to what Sophie had to say, but she would not defend or justify her decisions. They were made, implemented, and final. The following afternoon, Margaret positioned herself in the guest room, angling the laptop so the background showed only a neutral wall rather than any identifying details of Eliza's home. At precisely 2 p.m., the incoming call notification appeared on screen. Taking a deep breath, she accepted the call. Sophie's face appeared, tight with barely contained emotion. She was in what appeared to be Marcus's home office, the formal bookshelves and dark wood paneling creating an atmosphere of forced gravitas. Mom, she began without preamble, what you've done is unforgivable. Margaret kept her expression composed. Hello, Sophie. I assume you're referring to the trust arrangement. Not just the trust. Sophie's voice rose sharply. Disappearing. Without a word, ignoring our calls for weeks, and then dropping this bombshell by email. Do you have any idea what you've put us through? The police actually came to our house because Mrs. Rivera reported you missing. I left Mrs. Rivera a note, explaining I was taking a trip with a friend. Margaret replied calmly. If the police were involved, it was because you chose to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Sophie's face flushed. You vanished, Mom. With her. The last word dripped with disdain. A woman who showed up out of nowhere and has systematically turned you against your real family. Eliza hasn't turned me against anyone, Margaret corrected her. Your actions, and Marcus's, accomplished that quite effectively without any outside help. She held up a hand as Sophie started to protest. I know about the money you took from our accounts while your father was dying. I know about the conversations. Marcus had with him, pressuring him to sign over the house. "I know everything, Sophie." Momentary shock flashed across Sophie's face before her expression hardened. "Dad offered to help with our down payment. Those withdrawals weren't theft. They were his way of supporting us while avoiding Marcus's pride. He knew Marcus wouldn't accept direct financial help, so we arranged it discreetly." The blatant lie struck Margaret like a physical blow. She had seen Robert's documentation, read his own words about the unauthorized withdrawals. That Sophie could look her in the eye and fabricate such a story revealed a capacity for deception Margaret had never imagined in her daughter. "Be that as it may," Margaret replied, not bothering to challenge the falsehood directly. "The house has now been placed in trust. After my lifetime tenancy, it will be sold to benefit the scholarship fund at your father's college. That decision is final and legally binding." "You had no right!" Sophie exploded. "That house was our inheritance, the children's inheritance. How could you give away their birthright to strangers?" "The house was never your birthright, Sophie. It was mine and your father's to do with as we chose." Margaret kept her voice level. "We worked and saved for decades to create the life we wanted. You seem to believe you're entitled to the fruits of that labor simply by virtue of being our daughter." "What about her?" Sophie demanded. "What does she get out of all this?" "Eliza?" Margaret shook her head slightly. "Nothing beyond the satisfaction of honoring her father's wishes and helping me secure my independence. Unlike some, she has no financial interest in my property." The barb hit its mark. Sophie flinched visibly before her expression settled into cold anger. "You've changed, Mom. You used to care about family above everything. Now you're throwing away decades of connection for someone you barely know." "I haven't changed," Margaret corrected her gently. "I've simply stopped allowing my love for you to blind me to the reality of how you and Marcus view me, as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected." She leaned closer to the screen, her voice softening. "I will always love you, Sophie. You're my daughter, and nothing can change that. But love doesn't require me to surrender my autonomy or security." "So that's it?" Sophie's voice cracked slightly. "You're choosing her over us? Over your grandchildren?" "I'm not choosing anyone over anyone else," Margaret replied firmly. "I'm choosing myself. My dignity, my independence, my right to determine my own future. If you can respect that choice, there's no reason we can't rebuild our relationship over time." Sophie's laugh was brittle. "Respect your choice to disinherit your own family? To run away with a stranger? To cut us out of your life without warning? If that's how you choose to see it, then yes." Margaret maintained her composure despite the twisting pain in her chest. "The trust decision stands, Sophie. The sooner you accept that, the sooner we can move forward." "There is no moving forward from this betrayal," Sophie declared, her voice cold again. "When you come to your senses, you know where to find us." Before Margaret could respond, the screen went black. Sophie had ended the call. For several long moments, Margaret sat perfectly still, absorbing the finality of what had just transpired. She had held out a thin hope that beneath Sophie's anger and Marcus's influence, her daughter might still be capable of understanding, of growth. That hope now seemed painfully naive. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Mom?" Eliza called gently. "Is it okay if I come in?" "Yes," Margaret answered, closing the laptop. Eliza entered with 2 steaming mugs of tea, setting one beside Margaret before taking a seat on the edge of the bed. "How did it go?" Margaret accepted the tea gratefully. "About as well as could be. Expected. Which is to say, not well at all." She recounted the conversation, including Sophie's audacious lie about the withdrawals from Robert's account. "I'm so sorry," Eliza said when she had finished. "I know you hoped for something else." "I did," Margaret admitted. Foolishly, perhaps. They sat in companionable silence, sipping their tea. Outside the window, A light rain had begun to fall again, tapping gently against the glass. "The strange thing is," Margaret said finally, "beneath the hurt and disappointment I feel lighter. As if I've set down a burden I've been carrying for a very long time." Eliza nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the hardest liberations are the most necessary ones." Margaret considered the words, finding truth in them. She had spent years tiptoeing around Sophie's moods, making allowances for Marcus's controlling behavior, surrendering pieces of herself bit by bit in the name of family harmony. The confrontation, painful as it was, had severed those constraints definitively. "What now?" Eliza asked softly. Margaret gazed out at the rain-washed garden, a sense of possibility unfurling within her. "Now," she said with quiet certainty, "I begin again." Spring melted into summer, bringing long, golden evenings to Portland. Margaret had settled into Eliza's townhouse with surprising ease, gradually transforming the guest room into a space that reflected her evolving sense of self. Robert's photograph remained on the nightstand, but it had been joined by new additions: a vase of fresh flowers changed weekly, a small collection of art books from Powell's, sketches from her weekly outings with Diane's painting group. On a particularly warm Saturday morning in July, Margaret stood before the bedroom mirror, frowning slightly at her reflection. Her silver hair, neatly maintained in the same practical bob she'd worn for decades, suddenly seemed at odds with the person she was becoming. "Problem?" Eliza asked, pausing in the doorway with a basket of laundry. Margaret tugged at a strand of hair thoughtfully. "I think I'm ready for a change." That afternoon found them at Eliza's favorite salon, a bright space filled with potted plants and the mingled scents of essential oils. The stylist, Nadia, listened attentively as Margaret explained what she wanted. Something lighter, less severe. Something that feels more me. Nadia circled Margaret's chair, studying her bone structure with professional intensity. "Your face has beautiful angles. We could do something softer around the edges. Maybe some layers to give it movement. And your hair has this lovely natural wave that's being suppressed by the weight." "I trust your judgment," Margaret decided. "Just make me look like the person I feel like inside." As Nadia worked, snipping and shaping with confident precision, Eliza caught Margaret's eye in the mirror. "You seem different today, more decisive." Margaret considered this. "I feel different. All these weeks in Portland, I've been rebuilding myself in small ways, trying new foods, walking new streets, making new friends through the painting group. But I've still been carrying this." She gestured vaguely toward her reflection. "This external version of the person I was expected to be. Robert's wife, Sophie's mother, the perfect suburban grandmother." "And now?" Eliza prompted. "Now I'm ready to be Margaret," she replied simply. "Just Margaret." When Nadia finished, the transformation was subtle yet profound. The severe bob had given way to a gently layered style that framed Margaret's face softly, emphasizing her cheekbones and bringing out the natural silver highlights in her hair. She looked younger somehow, or perhaps just more present, more alive. "What? Do you think?" Nadia asked, turning the chair so Margaret could see the back. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that I've finally found myself again." That evening, they celebrated with dinner at a small bistro in Eliza's neighborhood. Over glasses of wine and plates of perfectly roasted salmon, they discussed Margaret's plans for the coming weeks. "Diane's art group is planning a weekend trip to the coast," Margaret mentioned. "A sort of painting retreat. She's invited me to join them." "You should go," Eliza encouraged. "Your watercolors have been improving so quickly." Margaret smiled, slightly embarrassed by the praise. "I've been practicing. It feels good to create something again, even if it's just for myself." Their conversation was interrupted by a text message alert on Margaret's phone. She checked it automatically, then froze. "What is it?" Eliza asked, noting her sudden tension. Margaret handed her the phone. On the screen was a photo of the house on Maple Street. The garden she had tended so carefully was visibly overgrown, and a large dumpster sat in the driveway. The message from Mrs. Rivera was brief but alarming. "Thought you should know. They've been coming and going for days, bringing things out, not in." "They can't do this," Eliza said immediately, professional instincts kicking in. "The trust agreement explicitly forbids any modifications to the property without written permission from the trustees." Margaret took a slow sip of wine, processing this latest development. "They're trying to force my hand. They think if they start making changes, I'll either return to stop them or finally agree to sell to avoid further damage. We need to act quickly," Eliza said, already mentally calculating next steps. "I'll contact the trust attorneys first thing Monday morning. We may need a cease and desist order." Margaret nodded in agreement, but with less urgency than Eliza might have expected. "We'll handle it legally, yes. But I won't let this pull me back into their manipulation tactics. I've come too far." She ran a hand through her newly styled hair, a physical reminder of the changes she'd embraced. "Let's not let this ruin our evening. The attorneys can handle it on Monday." Monday morning brought swift action. The trust attorneys, armed with photographs Mrs. Rivera had continued to supply over the weekend, filed for an emergency injunction. By Tuesday afternoon, Margaret received confirmation that the court had ordered Sophie and Marcus to cease all activities on the property immediately and to remove the dumpster within 24 hours. "What were they even doing?" Margaret asked Eliza as they reviewed Mrs. Rivera's additional photos. "It looks like they were emptying closets, not renovating." Eliza studied the images more closely. "Based on what I can see in these photos, they appear to have been removing personal items, books, artwork, possibly some furniture, things that aren't permanent fixtures of the house." The realization struck Margaret with unexpected force. They were taking Robert's things, our things, family photographs, albums. Her voice caught. His collection of naval history books, his records. Eliza's expression softened with compassion. "I'm so sorry, Mom. The injunction should prevent any further removal, but what's gone is likely gone," Margaret finished for her, a deep sadness settling in her chest. Despite her months of emotional and physical distance from the house, the idea of Sophie and Marcus callously discarding or claiming Robert's treasured possessions felt like a violation. That evening, Margaret retreated to the meditation garden, behind the townhouse, seeking solace in its tranquil confines. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the small space as she tried to reconcile her feelings. The sense of violation was profound, yet she found herself remembering Robert's words from long ago. "Things are just things, Maggie. They hold memories, but the memories live in us, not in the objects." She had been focusing on moving forward, creating a new life beyond the constraints of her old one. Perhaps this forced separation from physical mementos was part of that process. Painful, but ultimately freeing. When she returned inside, she found Eliza at the dining table, surrounded by legal documents. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, settling into the chair opposite her, "about what happened at the house." Eliza looked up, setting aside her papers. "What's on your mind?" "I'm angry about what they did," Margaret admitted. "Taking Robert's things without asking feels cruel, deliberately hurtful. But I've also realized something important." "What's that?" "I don't want to live in that house again," Margaret said firmly. "Not now, not ever. It holds too many memories, both good and painful. I thought I was just taking a break, gaining perspective, but the truth is, I've moved on. Inside myself, I've already moved on." Eliza considered this thoughtfully. "That's a significant realization. What does it mean practically?" "It means I'm ready to make Portland my permanent home," Margaret replied. Or somewhere near here, at least. I'd like to find my own place eventually. Something smaller, closer to the art district, perhaps. But I know now that my future isn't on Maple Street. What about the trust arrangement? Your life estate? We can modify it, Margaret suggested. The house could be sold now rather than after my lifetime, with the proceeds still going to Robert's scholarship fund. Perhaps with a small portion set aside for me to establish a modest new home here. As they discussed the logistics, Margaret felt a growing sense of certainty. This wasn't an impulsive reaction to Sophie and Marcus's latest transgression, but rather the natural conclusion to months of internal transformation. The following morning, Margaret woke early and made coffee before Eliza had stirred. She carried her mug out to the meditation garden, watching as the first light of dawn illuminated the small space. A sense of peace settled over her, not the resignation of surrender, but the quiet confidence of someone who had found her path. When Eliza joined her, still in her pajamas with sleep-tousled hair, Margaret shared her decision. "I'm ready to sell." "The house," she said simply. "Not to Sophie and Marcus, but through the trust, for the benefit of the scholarship fund, and I'd like to start looking for a small place of my own here in Portland." Eliza's smile held a mixture of happiness and something like pride. "You're sure?" Margaret nodded. "I've never been more certain of anything. It's time to truly begin, again, without the weight of the past holding me in place." She reached out to touch a delicate Japanese maple that formed the centerpiece of the tiny garden. "I think I'd like a place with a small garden, though. Some things from my old life are worth carrying forward." The for sale sign appeared on the Maple Street property in early August. Margaret, working with the trust attorneys, had arranged for a reputable realtor to handle the listing. The proceeds would establish the Robert Wilson Memorial Scholarship at the community college where he had taught for 30 years, with a modest portion set aside for Margaret's new home in Portland. She had remained firm in her decision despite a flurry of increasingly desperate messages from Sophie and Marcus. Their tactics had evolved from anger to bargaining, then to a peculiar blend of guilt and nostalgia. "Think of all our family memories in this house," Sophie had written. "How can you just sell it to strangers?" Margaret had responded only once with simple clarity. "The decision is final. The house will be sold, and the proceeds will honor your father's legacy through education, something he valued deeply. I hope someday you'll understand and respect this choice." On a bright September morning, Margaret sat in a small cafe near Portland's Pearl District, reviewing listings with Eliza. The real estate market in Portland was competitive, but they had identified several promising properties that matched Margaret's criteria: a small house or townhome with a modest garden space, preferably within walking distance of shops and the arts district. "This one has potential," Eliza said, indicating a renovated bungalow with a charming front porch. "It's at the upper end of your budget, but the location is perfect. 3 blocks from the art supply store and within walking distance of the weekly farmers market." Margaret studied the listing thoughtfully. "It does look lovely. Let's add it to the viewing list for tomorrow." As they continued their discussion, Margaret noticed a woman at a nearby table glancing in their direction repeatedly. She was elegantly dressed, perhaps in her 60s, with a stylish silver bob and striking turquoise jewelry. After several minutes of not quite subtle observation, the woman approached their table with a warm smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help noticing your watercolor portfolio," she said, gesturing to the leather case propped against Margaret's chair. "Are you an artist?" Margaret felt a flush of unexpected pleasure at the designation. "An enthusiastic amateur," she replied modestly. "I've recently returned to painting after many years away from it." "I'm Eleanor Dunham," the woman introduced herself. "I run a small gallery just around the corner, Dunham Contemporary. We focus primarily on Pacific Northwest artists, particularly women over 50. She extended a business card. "We're hosting a group show next month called Second Acts, featuring artists who found or reclaimed their creative voice later in life. I'd love to see your work." Margaret accepted the card, stunned by the unexpected overture. That's very kind, but I'm really just a beginner. Experience and technical skill are only part of what makes art compelling, Eleanor replied. Authentic voice and perspective are equally important. Would you mind? She gestured toward the portfolio. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret unzipped the case and removed several recent watercolors, landscapes from her coastal weekend with Diane's group, studies of flowers from the farmer's market, and a series of small works capturing the changing light in Eliza's meditation garden. Eleanor examined them with professional attention, occasionally making small sounds of appreciation. These have a wonderful quality of presence, she commented. You capture light beautifully. There's patience in these brushstrokes, a willingness to observe before acting. It's refreshing. She handed the paintings back carefully. I'd like to include 2 or 3 pieces in our second act's show, if you're willing. Nothing formal or high pressure, just an opportunity to share your perspective. Our gallery takes a very modest commission, and the focus is on creating community among artists at similar life stages. Margaret glanced at Eliza, who gave an encouraging nod. I'd be honored, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Thank you for the opportunity. After exchanging contact information and arranging a time to bring selected works to the gallery, Eleanor departed with a final warm smile. Margaret sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just occurred. Did that really just happen? She asked Eliza. Did I just get invited to show my paintings in a real gallery? Eliza's expression was delighted. You absolutely did. And it's completely deserved. Your work has developed so much these past months. As they walked home, Margaret felt a curious lightness in her steps. The invitation itself was flattering, of course, but what struck her most profoundly was how differently she had responded to the opportunity compared to how she might have just months earlier. 6 months ago, I would have declined immediately, she confessed to Eliza. I would have been too afraid of judgment, too certain I wasn't good enough. And today? Eliza prompted. Margaret smiled, tilting her face toward the autumn sunshine. Today I thought, why not? What's the worst that could happen? Someone might not like my paintings? I can live with that. The following week brought news from the realtor handling the Maple Street house. They had received multiple offers, all above asking price, creating a bidding war that would significantly increase the scholarship fund's initial endowment. Margaret signed the necessary paperwork with a sense of closure rather than loss. Staff, closing is scheduled for October 15th, she told Eliza that evening as they prepared dinner together. Perfect timing, actually. That's right around when Eleanor's gallery show opens. Have you decided which pieces you'll include? Eliza asked. Chopping vegetables for a stir-fry. I think so, Margaret replied. The sunrise series from the coast, the Japanese maple from your garden, and maybe the farmer's market in rain. Eleanor suggested I consider a theme of transition or transformation. Appropriate, Eliza observed with a smile. As September progressed, Margaret divided her time between house hunting, preparing her artwork for the gallery show, and continuing her weekly painting outings with Diane's group. The easy rhythm of her days provided a stark contrast to the tension-filled existence she'd known before leaving Maple Street. One unusually warm afternoon, she sat with Diane on a park bench, sketching a group of elderly Chinese men and women practicing Tai Chi beneath a canopy of golden leaves. I envy their balance, Margaret commented, trying to capture the flowing quality of their movements with quick brushstrokes. Both physically and spiritually. Diane nodded, adding a wash of amber to her own composition. They've been coming. Here every morning for years. Through rain, snow, whatever. There's power in that kind of commitment to practice. As they worked in companionable silence, Margaret reflected on how different her life had become in such a relatively short time. She had found not just new activities but a new community, fellow artists who valued her perspective, shopkeepers who greeted her by name, neighbors who saved interesting articles from the local paper because it seemed like something Margaret would enjoy. "You seem content," Diane observed, glancing at her friend's peaceful expression. "More settled than when we first met." "I am," Margaret agreed. "I've found my footing again." "Any word from your daughter?" Diane asked gently. She was one of the few people besides Eliza who knew Margaret's full story. Margaret shook her head. "Nothing direct. The attorneys tell me she and Marcus made a final attempt to block the house sale, but were firmly rebuffed by the court. Since then, silence." "And how do you feel about that?" Margaret considered the question seriously, rinsing her brush in a jar of cloudy water. "Sad, of course. I miss the daughter I thought I had. I miss my grandchildren terribly. But I've stopped expecting Sophie to suddenly transform into someone who can see beyond her own needs and Marcus's influence." She added a few more strokes to her painting, capturing the serene face of an elderly woman moving through her practice with graceful precision. "I've realized I can hold two truths simultaneously, that I love Sophie and always will, and that I cannot allow that love to become a weapon used against me." Later that week, Margaret and Eliza visited the bungalow they had spotted in the listings. The moment she stepped onto the front porch with its swing seat and potted chrysanthemums, Margaret felt a sense of rightness wash over her. The interior was modest but thoughtfully renovated, with large windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. The backyard, though small, offered enough space for the garden Margaret envisioned, a peaceful retreat like Eliza's but with room for a few vegetables and Robert's favorite roses. "It's perfect," she told the realtor, not bothering to contain her enthusiasm. "Absolutely perfect." That evening, she submitted an offer slightly above asking price, using a portion of the funds set aside from the Maple Street sale. By the following afternoon, she received word that her offer had been accepted. She would take possession on Maïd Satori, October 20th, 5 days after the Maple Street closing and 2 days after the opening of the Second Act's gallery show. "Everything's happening at once," she marveled to Eliza over a celebratory dinner. "It's as if the universe is confirming that I'm on the right path." Eliza raised her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings, and to perfect timing, and to unexpected opportunities," Margaret added, clinking her glass against Eliza's with a bright, clear sound that seemed to capture the moment perfectly, resonant with possibility and joy. The gallery opening for Second Acts was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening in mid-October. Margaret spent the afternoon in careful preparation, selecting a dress she had purchased during a shopping expedition with Diane, a simple but elegant midi-length outfit in deep teal that complemented her silver hair and brought out the blue in her eyes. She applied her makeup with more care than usual, finishing with a touch of the coral lipstick Eliza had convinced her to try. "You look beautiful," Eliza said when Margaret emerged from her room, "like a true artist making her debut." Margaret laughed, though a flutter of nerves danced in her stomach. "Hardly a debut at my age, but thank you." They arrived at Dunham Contemporary 30 minutes before the official opening. The gallery was a converted industrial space with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and strategic lighting that created intimate viewing areas within the larger room. Eleanor greeted them warmly, guiding Margaret to see how her paintings had been displayed. "I placed them here," Eleanor explained, "where the late afternoon light hits them beautifully. Your sense of color really stands out in this grouping." Margaret stood before her framed watercolors, 3 pieces that traced her journey of the past months through visual metaphor. The coastal sunrise with its tentative light breaking through clouds, the meditation garden's Japanese maple captured, in 4 seasonal states on a single canvas, and the farmer's market scene showing figures in rain gear beneath a canopy of colorful umbrellas. Seeing them professionally matted, framed, and displayed gave them a legitimacy that made her breath catch. "I can't quite believe they're mine," she admitted. "Imposter syndrome," Eleanor said knowingly. "Every artist experiences it, especially." Women our age. We've spent decades putting our creative selves last, raising families, supporting spouses, building careers that served others. Claiming space for our own expression feels almost transgressive. Other artists began to arrive, each greeted personally by Eleanor and introduced to their fellow exhibitors. Margaret was struck by the diversity of the group. Women ranging from their 50s to their 80s, working in various media from traditional watercolors to digital art, ceramics to textile installations. What united them was precisely what Eleanor had described. They had all found or reclaimed their artistic voices later in life, after other roles and responsibilities had dominated their earlier years. As 7 p.m. approached, gallery assistants circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. The space gradually filled with attendees, friends and family of the artists, gallery regulars, collectors, and curious passers-by drawn in by the opening night energy. Margaret stood near her paintings, watching as visitors paused to study her work. Some moved on quickly, others lingered, occasionally casting appreciative glances in her direction. Eliza remained nearby, radiating quiet pride and support. "Your daughter?" asked an elderly woman who had been examining the Japanese maple series with particular attention. "Yes," Margaret confirmed with a smile. "You have her eyes," the woman observed. "Or rather, she has yours. There's the same sensitivity to light in them that I see in your paintings." Before Margaret could respond, a familiar voice cut through the ambient gallery chatter. "Mom?" She turned slowly, disbelief momentarily freezing her in place. Sophie stood just inside the gallery entrance, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. She wore a conservative suit that seemed out of place among the gallery's artistic crowd, her hair pulled back in a severe style that reminded Margaret painfully of how she herself had worn her hair for decades. "Sophie," she said softly. "What are you doing here?" Sophie shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Rivera. She's been keeping me updated. She mentioned your gallery show, sent me the information." Margaret made a mental note to thank her neighbor for this unexpected intervention. "I see." An awkward silence fell between them. "Your hair is different," Sophie finally said. Margaret touched it self-consciously. "Yes, a change seemed appropriate." "It suits you," Sophie offered tentatively. "You look happy." "I am," Margaret confirmed, searching her daughter's face for clues to her purpose in coming. "Would you like to see my paintings?" Sophie nodded, following as Margaret led her to the small grouping of watercolors. They stood side by side, the familiar family resemblance between them visible despite the tension in their postures. "These are really good, Mom," Sophie said after studying them silently. "I didn't know you could paint like this." "Neither did I," Margaret admitted. "It's something I've rediscovered recently." Another silence, less strained this time. "The house sold," Sophie said finally. "Above asking price." "Yes, I know. The closing is next week." Sophie's shoulders tensed slightly. "Marcus wanted to contest it again. I told him no." Margaret turned to look at her daughter directly, surprised by this revelation. "You did?" Sophie nodded, her eyes fixed on the painting of the Japanese maple. "After you sent that evidence about the withdrawals during Dad's illness, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about what we did, what I allowed Marcus to convince me was okay." She drew a shaky breath. "I found Dad's medical journal, the one his doctor suggested he keep to track symptoms and medications. He wrote about those conversations with Marcus, about feeling pressured when he was at his weakest. He wrote about how afraid he was for you, about what might happen after he was gone." Margaret's heart ached at the image of Robert recording these fears in private, protecting her even as his strength was failing. "Why didn't you say anything before now?" she asked gently. Sophie's composure faltered briefly. Pride, shame, denial, take your pick. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "And Marcus, he can be persuasive, controlling. You saw it, didn't you? Long before I was willing to." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "We're separated," Sophie continued, the words coming more rapidly now. "Since August. He doesn't know I'm here. He wouldn't—" She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between them. Understanding dawned slowly. The controlling behaviors Margaret had observed in Marcus toward her had extended to Sophie as well, creating patterns of isolation and dependence she was only now beginning to recognize. "Sophie," she said carefully, "are you all right? Are the children all right?" "We're managing," Sophie replied with a brittle attempt at confidence. "I've gone back to work part-time. Admin staff at the community college, ironically enough. The scholarship. In Dad's name, it's a good thing, Mom, a really good thing." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and Margaret instinctively reached for her hand, bridging the physical gap that had seemed uncrossable just moments before. "I'm glad you think so," she said softly. It felt right to honor him that way. Around them, the gallery hummed with conversation and movement, but they remained in their own small bubble of tentative reconnection. "I found an apartment near the college," Sophie continued. "Nothing fancy, but it's ours. The kids are adjusting. Zach especially seems relieved." Margaret nodded, remembering her grandson's quiet tension whenever Marcus was present. "Children absorbed so much more than adults realized. And you?" she asked. "How are you adjusting?" Sophie's laugh held little humor. "Some days are better than others. I'm trying to remember who I was before everything became about maintaining Marcus's image of our perfect life." The parallel to Margaret's own journey wasn't lost on either of them. "I miss you," Sophie admitted suddenly. "The kids miss you terribly. Emma keeps asking when Grandma is coming home." Margaret felt tears threatening. "I've missed you all too, more than I can say." "I understand why you left," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why you needed to break free. I understand it now in a way I couldn't before." A gallery assistant approached with champagne flutes, offering them with a professional smile before moving on to other guests. Margaret and Sophie each took a glass, the mundane interaction providing a moment to collect their emotions. "I'm not coming back to Maple Street," Margaret said after a measured sip. "I've bought a small house here in Portland. It's where I need to be right now." "I know," Sophie nodded. "Mrs. Rivera told me that too. She's quite the intelligence operative." They shared a genuine smile for the first time. "But maybe," Sophie ventured hesitantly, "the kids and I could visit sometime? See your new place? Get to know—" She glanced across the room to where Eliza stood, deliberately giving them space while maintaining a watchful presence. "Get to know our family better?" Margaret felt something tight and painful within her chest begin to loosen. "I'd like that very much," she said sincerely. "And I think Eliza would too." As the evening progressed, they moved cautiously toward more comfortable conversation. Sophie met Diane and other members of the painting group, listened attentively as Eleanor explained why she had selected Margaret's work for the show, and even had a brief, civil exchange with Eliza near the refreshment table. Nothing was resolved completely. Years of complex dynamics couldn't be untangled in a single evening, but a door that had seemed permanently closed had opened just enough to allow for possibility, for evolution, for growth, for forgiveness. When it was time for Sophie to leave to catch her red-eye flight back east, she embraced Margaret with unexpected fierceness. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she whispered, "for finding yourself again, for being brave enough to start over." Margaret held her daughter close, feeling the weight of their shared history and the fragile promise of a different future. "It's never too late," she murmured, "for any of us." After Sophie had gone, Eliza approached with a gentle smile. "Okay, Margaret?" nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. A beginning, she said. Not an ending. The morning after the gallery opening, Margaret woke to find two small red dots on her painting in the online catalog for second acts. Eleanor called shortly after breakfast, her voice bright with excitement. "Your pieces have sold," she announced. Both the coastal sunrise and the farmer's market scene. A collector from Seattle was quite taken with your use of light and atmosphere. Margaret sat down abruptly, momentarily speechless. "Someone paid actual money for my paintings?" she finally managed. Eleanor laughed warmly. "Indeed they did. And above the listed price, I might add. They asked if you have more work available or if you accept commissions." After the call ended, Margaret sat in Eliza's meditation garden, absorbing this unexpected development. Being recognized as an artist, having strangers value her creative expression enough to purchase it, added another layer to her evolving identity. "I don't quite know how to feel about this," she admitted to Eliza over lunch. Pleased, certainly, but also a bit exposed. As if a private conversation has suddenly become public. "That's art," Eliza observed thoughtfully. "It's an intimate form of communication between strangers, but you don't have to pursue it commercially if that feels uncomfortable." Margaret considered this. "No, I think I like it. The idea that my perspective might resonate with someone I've never met. There's something profound in that connection." The following week brought the official closing on the Maple Street house and the transfer of keys to Margaret's new Portland bungalow. As she walked through the empty rooms of her new home, she felt a curious blend of excitement and trepidation. This space held no history, no accumulated memories, just possibility. "It's smaller than I'm used to," she noted as Eliza helped measure windows for curtains. "But it's entirely yours," Eliza reminded her. "Shaped by your choices alone." Moving. Day arrived with unseasonable sunshine. Margaret had purchased only essential furniture, a bed, a comfortable reading chair, a small dining set. The rest she would acquire gradually, allowing the space to evolve organically around her needs and preferences. Diane and several members of the painting group appeared mid-morning with housewarming gifts. Potted herbs for the kitchen windowsill, handcrafted ceramics, a beautifully woven throw for chilly evenings. "Every artist needs a proper studio," Diane declared, presenting Margaret with a professional-grade easel. "The small bedroom with northern light will be perfect." By evening, the little house had begun to feel like home. Margaret sat on her new front porch swing, watching as the setting sun painted the sky in precisely the palette she had used in her coastal watercolors. "I should throw a proper housewarming," she mused as Eliza joined her with mugs of tea. "Invite the painting group, Eleanor from the gallery, and perhaps—" she hesitated briefly. "Perhaps Sophie and the children when they're ready to visit." 3 days later, an email arrived from Sophie with tentative plans for a Thanksgiving visit. "Just the kids and me," she wrote. "If that timing works for you. I understand if it's too soon, or if you have other plans." Margaret read the message several times, noting its careful tone, neither presumptuous nor distant. She replied with equal care. "Thanksgiving would be lovely. My new home isn't large, but there's a comfortable pull-out sofa in the living room for you, and the kids could use the studio guest room. Eliza has offered to help with cooking, if you're comfortable with that arrangement." Sophie's response came quickly. "That sounds perfect. Eliza is family too. It's time we all acknowledge that." As Thanksgiving approached, Margaret established clear parameters for the visit. She would not discuss Marcus or the separation beyond what Sophie volunteered. Herself. She would make no judgments about Sophie's choices, past or present. She would focus on rebuilding connections rather than rehashing grievances. When she shared these intentions with Eliza during their weekly dinner, a tradition they had maintained even after Margaret moved into her own home, Eliza nodded approvingly. "Boundaries aren't walls," she observed. They're more like garden trellises, providing structure and support for healthy growth. 2 days before Sophie and the children were due to arrive, Margaret received an unexpected message from Marcus. The tone was businesslike, almost formal. "I understand Sophie and the kids are visiting for Thanksgiving. While I don't agree with many of the choices made recently, I recognize the importance of family connections, especially for Zach and Emma. I hope the visit goes well." Margaret showed the message to Eliza, her expression troubled. "What do you make of this?" Eliza considered, carefully. It could be a genuine attempt at civility, or it could be strategic, positioning himself as reasonable and supportive while Sophie takes steps toward independence. "How should I respond?" "Briefly and neutrally," Eliza advised. "Acknowledge the sentiment without engaging further." Margaret composed a simple reply. "Thank you for your message. The children's well-being remains my highest priority." As she pressed send, Margaret felt a quiet certainty settle within her. Whatever Marcus's motivations, whatever challenges lay ahead in navigating this new family dynamic, she would face them from a position of strength and clarity, no longer reactive, no longer defined by others' expectations or manipulations. She was Margaret Wilson, artist, mother, grandmother, friend, grandmother, and on her own terms, she was finally, truly free. Thanksgiving arrived with a gentle dusting of early snow, transforming Margaret's new neighborhood into a scene worthy of a holiday card. She rose before dawn, watching the white flakes swirl past her kitchen window as she prepared pie crusts and chopped vegetables for stuffing. The methodical work soothed her pre-visit nervousness. Sophie and the children were scheduled to arrive mid-morning. Eliza would join them later for dinner, giving Margaret time alone with her younger daughter and grandchildren, a thoughtful gesture that Margaret deeply appreciated. At precisely 10:30, a taxi pulled up in front of the bungalow. Margaret wiped flour-covered hands on her apron and hurried to the door. Emma was the first to reach her, launching herself into her grandmother's arms with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a 7-year-old. "Grandma, your house is so cute. And it's snowing, just like in the movies." Zach followed more sedately, his 11-year-old dignity requiring a more measured greeting, though his tight hug spoke volumes about how much he had missed her. Sophie came last, wheeling a small suitcase up the path, her face a mixture of apprehension and hope. "Welcome," Margaret said simply, holding the door open wide. "I'm so glad you're here." The initial moments were awkward, filled with careful politeness and surface-level observations about the journey and the weather. But as Margaret showed them around her new home, pointing out the small studio where the children would sleep and the cozy reading nook beneath a bay window, the artificial formality gradually dissolved. "It suits you," Sophie said, running her hand along a bookshelf Margaret had filled with art books and novels. "It feels like you." "That's exactly what I was aiming for," Margaret replied with a smile. "A space that reflects who I am now, not who I was expected to be." Something flickered in Sophie's eyes, recognition perhaps, or longing. "I'm still figuring that out for myself," she admitted quietly. While the children explored the backyard, marveling at the dusting of snow on Margaret's newly planted garden beds, the two women worked side by side in the kitchen. There was comfort in the familiar rhythm of holiday preparation, a shared language that required no words. As Sophie diced onions for the stuffing, she broke the companionable silence. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said, eyes fixed on the cutting board. "Trying to understand how I ended up so disconnected from myself, from what I really wanted." Margaret continued kneading dough, giving her daughter space to continue. At her own pace. "She thinks I've been living in a state of learned helplessness," Sophie went on. "First with Dad, who always made everything so easy for me, and then with Marcus, who made all the decisions. I never had to develop my own, what does she call it? Internal locus of control." "That sounds insightful," Margaret offered carefully. Sophie looked up with a small, self-deprecating smile. It's hard, looking at yourself honestly. I understand now why you needed to leave, why you couldn't just keep accommodating what everyone else wanted. Before Margaret could respond, Zach burst through the back door, cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. Grandma, can we build a snowman in your garden? There's enough snow by the fence. The moment of deeper connection passed, but something had shifted subtly between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that they were both works in progress, finding their way toward more authentic versions of themselves. Eliza arrived at 4 o'clock, bearing a bottle of wine and a bouquet of autumn flowers. Emma, who had warmed to the idea of a new aunt with the adaptability of childhood, immediately took her hand to show her the snowman family they had created. In the garden, a snow grandma, a snow mommy, a snow Zach, a snow me, and a snow Aunt Eliza. The adults exchanged glances over the child's head, recognizing the significance of the Snow family's composition, and who was notably absent from. A dinner was served at Margaret's new dining table, which just comfortably accommodated the 5 of them. The traditional Thanksgiving foods took on new meaning in this fresh context. Old recipes prepared in a new kitchen, family bonds being reconfigured and strengthened with each passing hour. As they finished the meal with slices of Margaret's pumpkin pie, Emma asked innocently, Grandma, can we see where you make your paintings? Margaret led them to her small studio, where her easel stood near the north-facing window. Several works in progress were displayed on the walls, studies for a new series inspired by Portland's winter light. These are really good, Zach said with genuine appreciation. Way better than the stuff we do in art class. Your grandmother sold 2 paintings at her gallery show, Eliza told them proudly. She's becoming quite well known in the local art community. Really? Sophie looked at Margaret with new respect. Professional paintings? People paid for them? Margaret nodded, feeling a flush of pleasure at her daughter's evident admiration. Eleanor, the gallery owner, has asked for more work for their holiday exhibition next month. I've been considering a series focusing on winter transitions. As she described her artistic plans, Margaret noticed something she hadn't fully articulated, even to herself. She had found not just a hobby, but a purpose. Her paintings had become a means of communication, a way of processing her experiences and sharing her unique perspective with others. Later that evening, after the children had been tucked into their beds in the studio, the 3 women sat in the living room with glasses of wine. The conversation flowed more easily now, touching on Sophie's new job at the community college, Eliza's recent legal cases, and Margaret's growing involvement with the local art scene. Diane, my friend from the painting group, is organizing an arts program for seniors at the community center, Margaret mentioned. She's asked me to help teach a watercolor class starting in January. You'd be a wonderful teacher, Sophie said sincerely. It's strange, Margaret reflected, gazing into her wine glass. At this stage of life, I never expected to find such a clear sense of purpose, of contribution. Eliza smiled. Second acts, she said, echoing Eleanor's gallery theme. Sometimes the most meaningful chapters come later in the story. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This new life she had built, this home, these relationships, this creative pursuit, was entirely her own. Not inherited, not prescribed, but chosen with deliberate intention. The painting she had begun that morning, temporarily set aside for holiday preparations, waited on her easel. It depicted a winter garden at dawn, dormant but full of hidden potential, seeds beneath the snow, waiting for their moment to emerge. The new year arrived with a fresh challenge. On a bitter January morning, Margaret sat in her studio, phone pressed to her ear, listening to Sophie's strained voice. The doctors say it's definitely a recurrence, Sophie explained, her words careful but heavy with worry. Same type of lymphoma Dad had. He's really scared. The treatment protocol is intensive. Months of chemotherapy followed by radiation. Margaret closed her eyes, memories of Robert's illness washing over her. The endless hospital visits, the devastating side effects, the gradual diminishing of his once robust frame. "I know we're separated," Sophie continued when Margaret didn't immediately respond. "But he doesn't have anyone else. His parents are too elderly to provide much support, and you know he never maintained close friendships. He's asking—" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request she needed to relay. "He's asking for me," Margaret finished for her, understanding instantly. "Not just you," Sophie clarified. "Both of you. He specifically mentioned Eliza. Said he needs to make amends before—" Her voice cracked slightly. "Before things potentially get worse." Margaret's mind raced. Was this genuine? A deathbed conversion? To family harmony? Or was it another manipulation tactic, using illness to regain control, to pull her back into his orbit? "I understand your hesitation," Sophie said quietly, reading her silence correctly. "After everything that happened. But the oncologist says his prognosis is guarded at best. Whatever else he's done, he's Zach and Emma's father." That simple truth cut through Margaret's tangled emotions. Whatever her feelings toward Marcus, her grandchildren were facing the potential loss of their father. A pain she would spare them if she could. "When does treatment begin?" she asked, reaching for her calendar. "Next week. They want to start aggressively." Margaret took a deep breath. "Let me talk to Eliza. We'll need to make arrangements." 3 weeks later, Margaret stood at Marcus's hospital bedside. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by illness and humbled by circumstance. Eliza remained slightly behind her, a quiet, supportive presence. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said, his voice raspy but sincere. "Both of you." "Of course," Margaret replied simply. In the sterile hospital room, with the steady beep of monitors, marking time, Margaret felt the full circle of her journey. 2 years ago, she had fled from this man's control, fighting for her independence and dignity. Now she returned not as a victim, but as a woman of compassion and strength, offering kindness without surrendering her boundaries. "I was wrong," Marcus said after a moment of silence. "About so many things. The house, your choices, your right to your own life." His eyes shifted to Eliza. "About family, too. What it really means." Margaret nodded, accepting his words without needing to validate or dispute them. "We all have our paths to understanding," she said quietly. As she left the hospital later that day, arm linked with Eliza's, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The woman who had once escaped in the night, afraid and uncertain, now walked with steady purpose. She had found not just freedom but meaning. In her art, in authentic relationships, in the quiet confidence of self-knowledge. The path ahead would hold new challenges, but she would face them on her own terms, with clarity and grace. Her life, at last, was truly her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.